Hello and welcome to the QTV News Desk. Headlines in the news: Chilanga District Council Chairperson Maria Malila has died. Former Finance Minister Ms. Tumbekom Sokotwani has advised the government to reconsider its stance on borrowing more as the country already has a huge debt burden. Hello once again with the news in detail. My name is Chitalu Chinsenge. Chilanga District Council Chairperson Maria Malila has died. Mrs. Malila is a wife to Supreme Court Judge and former Attorney General Mumba Malila. Mrs. Malila died on Sunday morning at the University Teaching Hospital, UTH, where she was rushed to. The body is currently at the UTH mortuary. And UPND leader Hakainde Hichilema says he is in shock to learn about the sudden demise of Mrs. Malila. Mr. Hichilema says Mrs. Malila was providing a lot of guidance to the councillors, not only in Chilanga but throughout the country. He has since called UPND members and the Zambian people to mourn this gallant woman with dignity. Meanwhile, Patriotic Front Secretary General Davis Mwila has expressed sadness at this untimely death of Mrs. Malila. Mr. Malila says the Patriotic Front family. Mr. Mwila says the Patriotic Front family mourns with the family of Mrs. Malila and the United Party for National Democracy, for National Development (UPND) over this untimely loss. He says the party further sends words of comfort to the people of Chilanga who have lost their representative. This is contained in a statement issued to QTV News by PF Media Director Sunday Chanda. Former Finance Minister Tumbekom Sokotwani has expressed concern that despite the government being advised against excessive borrowing, they have continued saying this will have a huge impact on Zambia's fiscal deficit. Dr. Msokotwani, who is also Liwa UPND Member of Parliament, has told journalists in Lusaka that Zambians should worry with the PF government's appetite for borrowing, adding that they are putting the country at risk. Dr. Msokotwani says due to the huge debt that the country has accrued, the cost of living has become expensive in Zambia. He has advised the government to reconsider its stance on borrowing more as the country already has a huge debt burden. The former finance minister says this situation has a capacity to affect Zambia's investment, as the investors would think twice before investing in the country.
Basically is to appeal to the PF government once again to stop the reckless borrowing that is taking place in the economy. You've heard me now and over again speaking against the type of borrowing that is taking place. As we sit now, it is not just the UPND that has given warnings against this borrowing. We have had we've got warnings from the IMF. We have had warnings from the World Bank. We have had warnings from the African Development Bank. We have also had warnings from some of the international media that are closely watching the economic situation in Zambia. For example, Bloomberg, the international business media, have been warning about the excessive borrowing in Zambia. We've also had warnings from the Africa Confidential Report, which issued the report, I think, about a week ago. Everybody is worried about the level of debt that Zambia has attained. Everybody is warning against that. The only people who don't see the danger of this is the government itself.
Government has started implementing the dual citizenship clause for Zambians in the diaspora who lost their citizenship as a result of acquiring nationality of other countries. The Citizenship Board, which is chaired by Home Affairs Minister Stephen Kampyongo, will now register within 6 months a person who ceased to be a citizen of Zambia as a result of acquiring citizenship of another country. Mr. Kampyongo said in an interview that the board is currently sitting every quarter to access the applications that are coming through. He has, however, clarified that the clause is only applicable to those in countries that also allow for dual citizenship. He has since stated that all is in place for applications to come through and be accessed, however, noting the need for more sensitization on the clause by relevant authorities. The Economics Association of Zambia, EAZ, has disagreed with calls that government forgoes its plans to pursue an International Monetary Fund (IMF) program. EAZ President Crispin Mpoka says his association is on record and still maintains that Zambia needs an IMF program. Dr. Mpoka says his association hopes that efforts from government to resuscitate negotiations with the IMF will be put back in place. In an interview by telephone with QFM News, Dr. Mpoka, who is a university lecturer, states that not having an IMF program will not be good for the country. Dr. Mpoka says conditions that the IMF will ask for should not be an issue because they are the same conditions the EAZ has been encouraging government to meet with or without the IMF. He has referred to the need to cut down on government expenditure and reducing budget deficits as some of such conditions that should meet even without the IMF program.
I do think it's necessary to have those reforms to the budget process. And as EAZ, we are on record having asked and put urged government in several meetings that we need an IMF program. But somehow that we don't have a program, I think it will not be good for the country. We hope efforts to resuscitate that process would be put back in place. Of course, there are certain conditions that should be met, and the IMF expects certain conditions to be met. But even without the IMF, those conditions are what we've talked about, to say we should slow down on bloating government expenditure and ensure that the deficit is within limit according to the programs of government, both the budget and also the stabilization program.
Housing and Infrastructure Development Minister Ronald Stotela has invited globally reputable corporations to bid for government contracts in Zambia in order to promote competition among contractors. The minister says he has noted that most large-scale contractors were only interested in bidding for contracts that were funded by their host countries. The cabinet minister says the president is keen to see quality work delivered by reputable corporations that also respected that 20% of the works were given to Zambian contractors. He was speaking in New Delhi, India, when he met ASP Global Corporation, who are interested in working with Zambia. And ASP Global Corporation Chief Executive Officer Harsh Sani said his corporation had a global footprint executing larger projects in various sectors. Meanwhile, Zambia's High Commissioner to India, Judith Kapichimpanga, said ASP Global Corporation was a reputable firm because it executed projects using its own financing. This is contained in a statement made available by First Secretary for Press and Tourism at Zambian Mission in New Delhi, India, Bangwe Navile.
The private sector and the private investment is welcome. The partnership with the government through EPC plus tank projects, we have created new districts in Zambia, which requires a full complement of infrastructure, it being healthcare infrastructure, education infrastructure, and housing, and of course road network, because we need to connect people. So we are investing heavily in the road infrastructure, but we need also to invest in housing, and of course healthcare. So if you can do a tank project where you come, build, operate, and later transfer to government, we will be more than ready to receive you even today.
Is the funds which are lying with the Rabobank to be invested in Zambia. So if we take one sector as a hospital, we can take other sectors also with the European companies, of course with the European companies. This is a small brief.
They are able to come.
President Edgar Lungu has been advised to realize that the fight against corruption in Zambia can never be won in fear. Civil rights activist Brebna Changala says whistleblowers should be allowed to freely speak and point out all corrupt elements without fear of being arrested when they do so. Mr. Changala says this is even when such whistleblowers tell President Lungu that both him and his cabinet are the first suspects in the fight against corruption. In an interview with QTV News, Mr. Changala says for the fact President Lungu is urging citizens to take part in the fight against the vice, he must also open up State House to investigations. Mr. Changala is suggesting to President Lungu to invite the Anti-Corruption Commission ACC to come and knock at the doors of State House. He says this is one way he thinks President Lungu will show political will to fighting against corruption in the country.
Well, I'm very, very happy that the President commented on the fight for corruption as a theme of the African Union. And it's very good that it's coming from the President of the Republic of Zambia and his colleagues from the AU. What is important is that we must all rise and fight corruption. And since the President has allowed us to comment and fight this corruption, my first prayer is that once we tell him that his cabinet, his colleagues, probably even himself, they are the first suspects in this corruption, he must not arrest us. That's the first warning. People have been scared to comment on anything because corruption cannot be fought with a political will.
The Road Transport and Safety Agency, RTSA, says the process of reviewing the Highway Code is still underway. RTSA Head of Public Relations Frederick Mwanga has disclosed that the consultation process and drafting of the new Highway Code has, however, been finalized. Mr. Mwanga says that the draft of the new Highway Code has since been submitted to the Ministry of Transport and Communication. In an interview with Q News, Mr. Mwanga states that this is for the purposes of further review and consequent approval. Mr. Mwanga notes that once the new Highway Code has been approved, his agency will publicize it throughout the country free of charge. He says this will be by also translating it at least in the seven major local languages.
So we are going flat out in terms of road safety sensitization because we believe the Zambian Highway Code, which is a revised Zambian Highway Code in its form, has got a lot of information that will help to change the mindset of the road users, the pedestrians, the cyclists, the motorists, and now the wheelbarrow pushers that have been using these roads for some time now. They don't know how to use the road, so we need to reach out to them so that they don't cause conflict on the road. We should understand that the road is a shared section.
Government has been challenged to disclose to the nation what the exact public debt is. MMD faction leader Nevis Mumba says his party is concerned the Zambian people do not know the precise amount owed in public debt. Dr. Mumba says, contrary to the earlier position by government that public debt is 8.2 billion United States dollars, his party's own investigation revealed that Zambia's debt is as high as $30 billion. In an interview with QTV News, Dr. Mumba says this amount includes $8 million of Chinese drawn debt. Dr. Mumba says the MMD therefore suspects there is something wrong with the figures that government is giving with respect how much is owed in public debt. He says that his party's counsel is that the Ministry of Finance keeps mind that it does not work in the interest of Zambia for government to hide the actual public debt. Dr. Mumba has cautioned that hiding public debt will only isolate Zambia internationally, as it once happened to the neighboring Mozambique.
So we have always known that there is something that is not straight on the numbers that are being given to us. However, our commitment to this issue is to advise the Minister of Finance that it doesn't work in our interest at all to hide any bit of our date, because that is going to isolate us internationally. It happened to Mozambique, and this is not opposition politics. This is really common sense politics. There's nothing we are hiding. If we have a challenge, we can only resolve it if we face it. Our debt is not $7 or $8.2 billion. Our debt is $23.4 billion. We have given the numbers to Ministry of Finance to disapprove them. They haven't done that. Why should we confess our true levels of debt? Because it brings back our integrity. It gives us a strategy to fight and normalize our economic situation in the country.
Media consultant Herbert Macha has projected a boom in the growth of television in Zambia. Dr. Macha has based his projection on the continued number of TV stations being set up following the introduction of digital terrestrial television, DTT, in the country. In an interview with Q News by telephone, Mr. Macha says this is a sign that there is a future in television. Mr. Macha says he has also taken note that there is equally a growth in radio. He states that his only concern with radio is that the cost of running radio stations in the rural areas has proved to be quite expensive. Mr. Macha says he has observed that this is what has also affected the performance of community radio stations. He is suggesting that it should be a government policy to support such struggling in rural areas.
We have also seen the growth in radio. My only fear for radio is that the cost of running radio stations in rural areas is quite expensive, and this has affected the performance of radio stations, especially community radio stations. And as such, they are really struggling in terms of providing content for the people in the localities in which they are based. My only appeal there is that it should be a government policy to support these community radio stations if we are to sustain them in the next 5 years, failure to which we are going to see a situation where some of them will close. Or basically they will be operating on shoestring and without fulfilling their mandate of providing basic information and the voices for local people.
The Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, CCPC, has discouraged against the use of disclaimers in business, saying that puts off the rights of the customer. CCPC senior investigator Mutemwa Nakamboa tells QTV News that this act contravenes Section 48, Cap 1 of the Competition and Consumer Protection Act number 24 of 2010 on prohibition of display of disclaimers. Mr. Nakamboa says disclaimers make it difficult for customers to get a refund, exchange an item, or even return the product if it is defective. He says the law prohibits display of any disclaimer by traders to ensure that consumers are protected from such unfair trading practices.
We are doing we sensitize the traders on issues to do with disclaimers, because what a disclaimer does is that it puts out the rights of the consumer. What I mean is that if a consumer buys an item, he has the right to replace, to go and get a refund or a replacement if he finds that that product is defective or is unsuitable. But now what a disclaimer does is that it denies that right of a consumer. In other words, the trader runs away from his responsibility of giving the consumer a replacement or a refund. Basically, what we have done as a commission, we have instituted workshops with these trading houses where we engage them, we educate them about the Competition and Consumer Protection Act, the dangers of engaging themselves in bad vices of businesses and in unfair trading practices. Particularly Section 48(1), it talks about disclaimers, and once a business house is found reliable, they are to be fined about 10% of their annual returns. Oh, sorry, 0.1% of their annual returns, which is a lot of money.
Senior citizen Dante Saunders has challenged Zambia to ask themselves what they have gained since independence of their country from colonialism. Mr. Saunders says, having lived his life throughout the colonial time, he believes that there is nothing that Zambians have gained since independence to date. He thinks that Zambians are worse off today than they have ever been under colonial system. In his view, African countries such as Zambia will only be truly free when citizens take control of their republican constitution and politicians. Mr. Saunders has told QTV News that this is why, as a political activist, he will continue to fight until justice is brought about the poor and the vulnerable in Zambia. He states that rumors circulating that he is running for the position of Lusaka mayor are therefore not true.
My personal calling in life is that to be the in-between between the rich and the poor, or the vulnerable and those people who want to take advantage of us. So yesterday we celebrated our Africa Freedom Day. And you know, I asked the question up to this particular point in time, what have we actually gained throughout our independence? What have we gained on freedom and so on and so on? We are worse off today than we've ever been, even in the colonial system. And take it from me, I lived throughout the colonial system. So for me, I think Africa will truly be free when the people take control of the constitution and take control of all politicians.
United for Better Zambia UBZ President Hector Sondo has called on former Foreign Affairs Minister Harry Calabar to consider standing on his party as a presidential candidate for the 2021 general elections. Recently, Democratic Party had asked the former Foreign Affairs Minister to stand on the DP ticket in 2021 general elections. Addressing journalists in Lusaka, Mr. Sondo said his party feels that Mr. Calabar can make a good candidate. Mr. Sondo also says that the registration of his party has come about due to unsatisfactory leadership of a ruling party, PF, and its failure of existing opposition political parties to offer credible checks and balances with solutions. He says there is need for policy direction in the nation, saying in a normal functioning democracy, citizens expect their president to address the nation on policy direction, decision implementation of good governance policies. He says UBZ will ensure that citizens participate in process and decision making and implementation by good governance principles to help the emerging democracy for citizens. Meanwhile, Mr. Sondo says his party has observed with deep concern the violence escalating in the country perpetrated by youth of existing political party leaders by giving them a few coins to make when their families are safe abroad.
When you look at the policies under United for Better Zambia, it's a political party that includes each and everyone. And when you look at our policies that we have put on table, because of the ideologies, we saw Harry Calabar also to be one of the people who can be part of us, as long he is a Zambian and is able, because he's a person who can abide to our principles. So far as you can see, there are so many other political parties that have endorsed other people to stand. As you present, we are calling for him so that he can come also on board and work with us hand in hand so that we are able to push this country ahead.
As we're in the news, a recap of the headlines. Chilanga District Council Chairperson Maria Malila has died. Former Finance Minister Stumbeko Msokotwane has advised the government to reconsider its stance on borrowing more as the country already has a huge debt burden. That is all we had in the news. You can visit our website www.qtvzambia.com. Pleasant viewing and God bless.